There's a quiet belief that most of us carry that productivity equals output. How much you produced, how much you completed, how much you shipped, how much you advanced. And when output drops, we assume we've become less productive, less disciplined, less capable, less serious. But what if productivity was never about output? What if it was about agency? Not how much you did, but how much choice you had in what you did. That changes everything. For a long time, productivity has been measured almost entirely by output. How much you completed, how many tasks you finished, how fast you moved through your workload. And on the surface, that seems logical. Organizations need to get things done. Projects need to move forward, and your work needs to produce results. So naturally, we started measuring productivity in terms of visible output. Let's take a closer look at this. Most of our productivity advice was designed for factory work. In the industrial era, productivity meant more units per hour. But today, most of us are knowledge workers. Our job isn't to produce more widgets, it's to make better decisions, solve problems, and think clearly. And yet we still measure productivity like we're standing on an assembly line. The problem is that over time, that metric became the only metric. Instead of asking, did the work get done well? Or did this person have the right conditions to perform well? The conversation slowly shifted to how much did you produce? How fast did you produce it? And why aren't you producing more? And that shift matters more than people realize because once output becomes the primary metric, the system starts optimizing for visible activity, not sustainable performance. Let's think about what most people's work days actually look like. Their calendar is filled up with meetings, the inbox is filling up with requests, the task list just keeps growing, but the expectation is still the same. Produce, deliver, execute. And if the output slows down, the immediate assumption is usually that something is wrong with that person, not the system. So the question becomes, if productivity isn't just about output, what actually matters? That's where a different concept comes in. A concept that productivity conversations almost never talk about: agency. Agency is a simple idea, but it has a huge impact on how people work. Agency is the ability to direct your own effort. It's the ability to decide what to focus on, when to shift priorities, how to allocate your attention, and how to respond when those conditions change. When people have agency, they can adapt to reality. If something urgent appears, they adjust. If energy drops, they resequence work. If priorities change, they can recalibrate. That flexibility allows productivity to remain stable even when the conditions aren't, because the person doing the work still has the ability to steer. There's actually quite a bit of research that supports this idea. Harvard Business Review has published several articles showing that autonomy, the ability to decide how work gets done, is one of the strongest drivers of motivation and performance in the workplace. So, in other words, when people have more control over their work, they tend to perform better, not because they're being pushed harder, but because they're able to direct their effort intelligently. And that's really what we're talking about here. Productivity isn't just about producing more, it's about having the agency to steer your effort toward the right things. Without that agency, even very capable people can struggle to sustain performance. But when agency disappears, productivity becomes fragile. Now that person is simply executing instructions. They're following the systems, responding to all of the demands, reacting to all the interruptions, but without the ability to adjust the workload itself. And that's when something interesting happens. You can have high activity without any real productivity. Someone might answer emails all day, attend back-to-back meetings, respond to requests immediately, and stay busy from morning until night. From the outside, that looks productive, but internally, something very different is happening. They're just reacting, not directing. Agency changes the equation because productivity isn't just about what gets done. It's also about who controls the direction of the work. Without agency, output becomes unstable. With agency, productivity becomes sustainable. And once you start looking at productivity through that lens, something becomes very clear. High output doesn't always mean someone is actually productive. Sometimes it means the opposite. Sometimes high output is a sign that someone has very little agency at all. So, this is where the conversation gets interesting because we often assume that people with high output must also have high control over their work. But in reality, that's not always true. There are many situations where someone produces a lot of work while having almost no control over their environment. So let's take a look at a few examples. Let's go back to the example that we talked about earlier, which I like to fondly call the meeting trap. So take someone whose day is filled with meetings. They attend every call, they respond to every single message, they follow up on every request. From the outside, they appear extremely productive. But if you ask them what they actually accomplished that day, the answer is often, honestly, I don't know, because their time wasn't directed, it was consumed. Another example is the reliable high performer, the person who solves problems quickly, who handles pressure well, who always delivers. What often happens to that person? More work gets routed to them. More responsibilities appear, more decisions land on their desk. Eventually, their workload becomes reactive. They're constantly responding to what the system needs, but they have less and less control over what they work on. Output stays high, agency drops. This dynamic also explains why burnout can appear in high performing people. From the outside, they're producing, delivering, moving quickly, but internally, they've lost control over the direction of their work. Their calendar is fixed, their priorities are dictated, their attention is constantly pulled in different directions. So even though output remains high, their sense of agency keeps shrinking. And eventually, that creates exhaustion. This is why measuring productivity purely through output can be misleading because output alone doesn't tell you who's directing the work, who's absorbing the pressure, who is carrying the cognitive load, and who is slowly losing control of their time. Let's briefly consider the opposite. There's going to be seasons where your output drops. Those are your transition periods, the recovery periods, the recalibration periods. They are so important. But from the outside, it looks unproductive. But internally, there's clarity, intentionality, choice. That's high agency. Your agency protects your identity. Your output is going to fluctuate, but your agency stabilizes. Once you start thinking about productivity in terms of agency instead of just output, then the conversation starts to shift. Instead of asking, how do I get more done? You start asking, how much control do I actually have over my work? Because that control is what stabilizes productivity over time. Let's look at two different scenarios. In the first scenario, someone has full control over their schedule. They decide when to focus, they decide what to prioritize, and they can move their work around when the conditions change. Now imagine a second scenario. Someone else's calendar controls their day. Their requests constantly interrupt their attention. The deadlines are just appearing unexpectedly, and the priorities shift without warning. Even if both people are equally skilled, their productivity will look very different. Not because one person works harder, but because one person has agency and the other doesn't. If you've ever had a day where you were able to fully focus on meaningful work, you probably noticed something. The work flows, decisions feel easier, Your energy stays more stable. You make progress without forcing it. That's what productivity looks like when agency is present. Now contrast that with a day full of interruptions. You're switching between tasks, answering questions, responding to messages. You're putting out small fires all day. Even if you're busy all day, progress feels fragmented. And by the end of the day, it's hard to point to something substantial that you actually moved forward. That difference isn't about discipline. It's about control over your attention. Agency stabilizes productivity because it allows people to adapt. When your conditions change, and they always do, people with agency can recalibrate. They can adjust their priorities, they can protect their energy, they can sequence work more intelligently. Without agency, people simply react. And reactive work almost always consumes more energy than deliberate work. This also connects directly to something we've talked about in earlier videos: capacity, because agency and capacity are closely related. In fact, you could think of them as two sides of the same system. Capacity determines how much work you can realistically carry. Agency determines how effectively you can direct that capacity. Both matter, but most productivity systems only talk about one of them. Imagine someone with high capacity but very little agency. They might have energy, skill, focus, but their workload is completely dictated by external demands, meetings, requests, interruptions, constant context switching. Even though they have the ability to perform well, the system keeps redirecting their attention. Over time, that erodes performance. Now, imagine the opposite scenario: someone with moderate capacity but strong agency. They have the ability to protect their focus, prioritize effectively, adjust their workload when needed, and even though their capacity isn't unlimited, their productivity remains stable because they're directing their effort intentionally. This is why some people appear incredibly productive even when they're not working longer hours. It's not necessarily because they're more disciplined, it's because they have more control over how their work unfolds. Their attention isn't constantly being fragmented, their priorities are clearer, and their capacity is being used more deliberately. If you've ever had a role where you had more control over your schedule, you probably felt this difference immediately. Suddenly, the work felt smoother, progress felt clearer, stress levels dropped, not because the work disappeared, but because the work was no longer constantly interrupting itself. Once you start seeing productivity this way, the goal changes. The goal is no longer just producing more output. The goal becomes protecting agency and capacity at the same time. For a long time, productivity conversations have focused almost entirely on output: how much you produce, how efficiently you work, how quickly you move through tasks. But output alone doesn't tell the full story, because output is the result of a system, not the system itself. Sustainable productivity depends on two things: capacity and agency. Capacity determines how much work your energy and attention can support. Agency determines how effectively you can direct that effort. When both of these elements are present, productivity becomes stable, work becomes more deliberate, and performance becomes more sustainable. But when agency disappears, productivity becomes fragile. Even highly capable people start to feel overwhelmed, not because they suddenly became less disciplined, but because they lost the ability to steer their work. So the next time you think about productivity, it might be helpful to ask a different question. Not just, how much did I produce today? But also, how much agency did I actually have over my work? Because productivity isn't just about output, it's about the ability to direct your effort toward what matters most. And when that ability is protected, productivity becomes far more sustainable.